Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I know the hour is getting late and we still have some very honored guests to get to. But David asked me to give sort of a recap of Franky Carrillo's case. And I have to say, as a state public defender, I've been doing this work for 22 years, representing death row inmates. We've seen executions in our office. But we see very few successes. And for us, a success is to have, a big success is to have the guilt decision overturned, to get a new trial, and to end up with life in prison without possibility of parole. That's a big win for us, and it doesn't happen very often. So in 2006, when I was approached by someone that I met at a private party who asked me, she had heard I was an attorney, and you know, I feel sorry for you guys, an attorney telling war stories when the hour is late, but I'll try to make it quick. She asked me if I would be willing to meet with a young man at Folsom Prison. She said she was a GED teacher, had just retired from Folsom, but she really believed that the inmate clerk that was working for her was innocent, and would I be willing to go to Folsom and either meet with him or take a look at his file. So, you know, having done death penalty work for many years and being involved in death penalty focus almost from the beginning of doing this work and knowing how important the issue of innocence is to our cause, I couldn't say no. She really ran into the right person, because I think a lot of people in our office would have said, I'm sorry, I'm a government employee, I can't do this work. But I was immediately drawn. I said, sure, I will go out and meet with him. Well, this young man here, Franky Carrillo, is the person I met, and he looked almost exactly like he does tonight, except that he was all dressed, well, he had a blue shirt and blue jeans like he's got on tonight. He was dressed in blue, but he was just this very nice-looking, respectable, sincere, kind, intelligent person that I was immediately drawn to, and really drawn to his file when I took a look at the evidence that he was showing me. I was literally hyperventilating when I went back to my office and told my boss about this case, because Franky had shown me 6 pages of original handwritten notes on yellow legal pad, scrawled out. I went through these 6 pages, and it was clear to me that it was basically a confession from the perpetrator admitting that he had done this drive-by shooting. The same drive-by shooting that Franky had been arrested for when he was 16 years old in Maywood, California. He did not live in Linwood, where the drive-by took place, and knew nothing about this drive-by shooting, but at 6 a.m. was aroused, he and his father thrown down on the floor by deputy sheriffs, LA sheriff's deputies, and they dragged him in and questioned him, and he knew nothing about it. Well, that was in 1991. He was convicted after 2 trials. The first jury was a hung jury, 7-5 for acquittal, but they retried him, and the evidence that they had against Franky were 6 supposed eyewitnesses. They were all young teenagers, 15, 16, 17 years old, that had been standing out in front of their house at night. It was pitch dark. It was in January at 7 o'clock at night, pitch dark, and there was a drive-by shooting. A car went past, and they got about 3 houses down the block, and somebody in the passenger seat turned around and shot at them. And unfortunately, one of the fathers of the kids was coming out, a 41-year-old man was coming out to tell the kids it's time to come in, and he took one of these bullets and died that night at the hospital. Now, when each one of these 6 kids was interviewed that night, just hours after the crime took place, all of them said they really couldn't say anything about a description of the shooter, and that seemed reasonable under the circumstances, but they said it's a Hispanic male. Well, they knew this because there had been a rivalry going on between the neighborhood Crips, an African-American gang, and the Hispanic gang Young Crowd. And there had been drive-by shootings going on between both gangs for quite a while. So it didn't take much to figure out that this was a carload of Hispanic kids. So they're going with Mexican teenagers, Hispanic males, but that's all they could say. That all changed radically a few hours later, a little bit after midnight, when these same kids were brought into the Linwood Sheriff's Department. And one of these kids, a 15-year-old by the name of Scott Turner, was singled out because he was someone that one of the deputies had dealt with before. So they got the one deputy and the one kid together alone, and after a few minutes alone together, Franky Carrillo became the suspect in the case, and he was the one they were going to look for, find, and arrest and prosecute for murder. What happened in those few minutes when Scott Turner was with Deputy Craig Ditch, who is now a lieutenant with the LA Sheriff's Department, was that they showed him a big book of gang photos. And apparently Scott Turner went through this book and started pointing to people. He was really being pressured to solve this crime. You know who did it, you saw, you're not going to let your buddy's dad get murdered like this. You got to do something. You got to help us out. He started pointing to pictures. And according to his testimony at the evidentiary hearing, the deputy said, no, it can't be him, that guy's dead. No, it can't be him, he's in jail. No, it can't be. So he finally got to Franky's picture, and the guy said, yeah, that's right. This is a guy who's trying to make a name for himself. He's a shooter. He's a troublemaker. All of that was untrue, though. Franky had no criminal record. He had never engaged in any act of violence. But his nickname was similar to another gang member's nickname, and they were looking for that other young man. The nickname was Spider. And in another case, another shooting that had happened 3 weeks before that, they had pretty much done the same thing. They took a six-pack, they showed it to the witnesses in that case. They said, we know this is Spider. Well, they didn't have Spider's picture in there. They had Franky's picture. And convinced the witnesses in the first case that Franky was the shooter in that case. Now the second case comes along. They use the same photo six-pack. And people have said to me, well, how is it they had Franky's picture to even put in the six-pack if he was not a guilty guy? Well, about a year before this incident happened, Franky and a friend, they were riding their bicycles in a park about a block from his home. It had been the park that he grew up around since he was about 3 years old. Doing nothing wrong, just riding his bike on the sidewalk when a deputy sheriff pulls up on the grass in his car, opens up his trunk, tells the boys to stop, pulls out a camera, asks them a few questions, and then takes their Polaroid photograph. And it was, in fact, that very photograph, because you can see the trees in the background from the park where they were, that photograph became the #1 photo in this photo six-pack lineup that became the evidence that got Franky sent to prison for 20 years, starting when he was 16 years old. At the time I looked at this evidence, I was just like, oh my gosh, now I didn't know anything about how the six-pack worked, but what I did have was what Franky showed me, these handwritten notes. And it turned out that the guy who had made those handwritten notes was willing to come in and tell the court that he had been involved in this drive-by and that Franky had not. On the day that Franky was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, that kid was sitting out in the hallway. He had brought an attorney with him. The attorney came into court, tried to stop the proceedings. It's on the record, which, I had access to and could read. And here's this kid, well, it's his attorney saying, Your Honor, we'd like to stop the proceedings. I have a client who is willing to come in and exonerate Mr. Carrillo and say that he wasn't involved and actually inculpate himself, admit that he was involved in this drive-by. Well, the DA at the time threw a fit, said it's too late. We've already had 2 trials. We're ready to get on with sentencing. And the judge agreed and said, we don't even have anything under oath. Well, of course, the kid was willing to come into court and testify under oath, but they were looking for a written declaration. So without that, the judge just moved on, and Franky was sentenced, and that was the end of it. So this all came together then when these notes were discovered. And I just thought, oh my gosh, this is a true case of innocence, and I begged my boss to let me work on it. But they said, no, 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 you're a government employee. So I called up Cookie Rodolphe and the Innocence Project. I had just met her a short time before that. And I called a number of law firms, and I was lucky enough that Cookie called back and said, we will take the case. And then this law firm of Morrison and Forster also called back and said they would take the case. So I just thought, this is great, we're home free. 2 years later, I was able to convince my boss to join the defense team, and we just rolled up our sleeves and put the case together, and it was a matter of a lot of miracles coming together, because we had no forensic evidence, but we had 6 eyewitnesses all picking out Franky in court saying that's the guy that did it. So it seemed like an impossible task, and I'll never forget when Linda Starr, who is here tonight, said, it was our first meeting, and she said, Ellen, you know, don't you, that these notes are not enough? You know, don't you, that if 6 witnesses identified Franky, it's likely that we won't get any hearing at all if all 6 witnesses have not recanted their testimony. If there's even one witness that is still saying Franky was the shooter, we may not be able to help him. And that was just overwhelming to me. I couldn't believe it was true, but she gave me the reality check. And as it turned out, it took quite a while, but little by little, we started with the victim's son. And thank God that family was a wonderful family. They had been through this terrible tragedy, but the son, who was 16 at the time, was now Franky's age. He was 35. At the time, and I told him, I said, I think there's been a mistake. And of course, he was one of the witnesses who identified Franky. And he was resistant, but little by little by little, he was willing to take a look at the evidence. And God bless them and their family, because the victim's brother, I know, said to me, if there's been a mistake made, we would rather have a guilty person go free than an innocent man spend his life in prison. And I knew then, I just got tears in my eyes, because I knew then that we had some hope. And so to make this very long story a little shorter, by the time we went to an evidentiary hearing with the Innocence Project and Morrison and Forster in March of 2011, all of the witnesses had recanted their testimony and admitted that they had not seen anything that night. The victim's son was the one who told me, Ellen, I picked Franky because I truly believed that Scotty Turner had seen what he said he saw. And he said, Scotty had looked at me and said, Damien, I'm telling you, it's number 1. I know it's number 1. And it was on that basis that then Damien gave his testimony identifying Franky and was able to convince his friends to do the same thing. They thought they were doing justice, but of course they weren't. So when we finally went to an evidentiary hearing and put on our case, it was very dramatic. Scotty Turner is in prison right now, and both he and Franky were sitting in their jail blue outfits. Franky was at the defense table, and Scotty Turner was sitting up in the witness chair. And he looked at Franky and said, Franky, I hope that you and your family can forgive me for what I did. And this is after he had already explained that it was this police officer, this deputy sheriff, that had actually influenced him to pick Franky. But Scott Turner took full responsibility and said, what I did was wrong, and I hope that somehow I can make it up to you and your family. And there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. And Franky said, I forgive you, Scotty. And within a couple of days, Franky was walking out, breathing free air, and is now a justice advocate for death penalty focus. He goes around speaking against the death penalty, and I'm so proud of him for that. When he was still in prison, we talked about it. I mean, we just dreamed that he would be out one day, but there was, of course, never any guarantee. But, you know, I said, Franky, I hope you don't forget what you've been through, and I hope you will work to make change for other people. And he said, I absolutely will. And I don't really know how he did it, except that he is a resilient human being with great compassion, great belief in himself, and he was an absolutely essential part of the defense team. All of the best ideas that we had to go forward, almost all of them came from Franky. And one of the things that really made a huge difference in the case is we were able to bring the judge out to the crime scene and do a reenactment of the drive-by shooting and prove that under those lighting conditions there was no possible way to make an identification. And I remember as we were driving out there, it kind of came on us quick because we weren't sure the judge was going to let us do it, but he finally agreed. And I remember, I think I was driving out with Linda, at least I remember having this conversation with Linda because she kind of grabbed me by the scruff and said, are you sure this is going to work? And I said, I think so. I mean, we had done it and I had seen with my own eyes, but when you know you're bringing the judge out to the crime scene, it's a little bit disconcerting, but it was great because one of the DAs that was there to observe also told me later that he texted back to his boss because his boss wanted to know what you could see, and all he said was, you can't see shit. And I was like, and that was really true. I mean, even walking out on that sidewalk, I couldn't even see the judge. I came up to him and I didn't even recognize the judge. It was so pitch black out there. And then you add that somebody is inside a car. They actually had to stop the vehicle right in front of them on the sidewalk, and you could not make out anything except a dark silhouette. So there was no way to tell race or sex or age or facial hair or any of the things that the witnesses claimed they could have seen. So I will end on that. I want to introduce Franky so that he can give the award to the Northern California Innocence Project for their work, not only on Franky's case, but right as this hearing was going on and all this work, they were getting the exoneration of 2 other individuals too. So they did a fabulous job, and we couldn't have done it if we hadn't all worked together as a team. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ellen, first of all, for those wonderful words and for recapping the entire story so elegantly as you did. You know, when David reached out to me and invited me to be here, I knew that the people gathering were going to be people who, I know if I would have reached out to any one of you during my plight, there would have been other Ellens involved, other people who would have joined in and helped. So for your presence, I thank you. You know, it was a miracle that I'm home. You know, Ellen and Linda really devoted their lives and a huge part of their careers to freeing me. So I want to just, in public, thank you once again. But since I've been home, I've had the honor of meeting Jeannie Woodford, who called me about 6-7 months ago and asked me if I would be a justice advocate for the death penalty. And I without hesitation, agreed. You know, many people have questioned my involvement and said, you know, Franky, after all that time in prison, the last thing you should do is, you know, re-engage yourself with that sort of theme and that sort of topic. You should sort of, you know, distance yourself from it. But I can't. You know, I know as an innocent man who spent 20 years in prison that there are other people who need help as well. And prior to prior to March 16th of last year, when the news broke out about my exoneration and my innocence, nobody was aware of who I was. My family was aware of who I was, my legal team, obviously, and some friends who had still were still in my life after 20 years. And so the news broke, and then people were aware of my story. And so my involvement to keep people alive is because I believe there's someone, he or she, some unnamed person, some unknown person who's a stranger to us right now that needs to stay alive to prove their innocence. And so my involvement is very, obviously very personal. But I am here to present this award to a good friend of mine. I love this lady very, very much, Linda Starr. And their involvement, the Innocence Project's involvement in my life was very, very critical and to prove my innocence. So Linda Starr.
Well, really, I have the greatest job in the world. I get to do work that matters, like most of you here, and that makes a difference. I'm often frustrated and even more often enraged, but I'm never bored. Most of all, I'm inspired. I'm inspired by people like Ellen Eggers, who's put her entire life into working for people on death row and into working for people like Franky Carrillo. I'm inspired by people like Maurice Posley, who you'll hear from after me, whose brilliant investigative journalism continues to expose injustice. And I'm truly inspired by people like Franky Carrillo, whose fortitude at being incarcerated at the age of 16 and whose grace in getting his exoneration 20 years later continues to inspire me. But I have not only the pleasure of working with these wonderful people and the honor of being honored by all of you, but I have the privilege of calling each of them also my friend. So thank you all here for honoring the work of the Innocence Project, and thank you, my friends, for being here to share this honor.